Ladies and gentlemen, the Brit Pack is back. It is show number 36 of the MMA podcast that brings you fighting talk with a distinctly British flavour. My name is Simon Head, and joining me, and he's told me, ladies and gentlemen, that this is the freshest he's been for a Brit Pack show in many a week, is Mr. Sandhu. How are you, Matt?
I'm very well, mate. I'm very well. Yes, normally the Sunday night UFC event coverage, which ends at about 6 a.m, knocks me and rocks me for a couple of days. But I'm not feeling too bad today, so I should be firing on all cylinders.
You can carry me this week because I'm knackered. So, but yeah, no, it should be good. It should be good. This is going to be a relatively short show. Now, we promise each other every week before we go on air that we'll keep it relatively short, and it normally ends up being like a 2-hour monster recording. This week we're going to try and keep it relatively short, and we're going to need a little bit of your help in the coming weeks, and we will talk about that towards the end of the show to find out exactly what you want to hear from us while we're in between some of the big shows. We've got a few things in mind as well, but yeah, we're going to call on you for a little bit of advice as well. But this weekend, Sandhu, as you say, UFC Fight Night in Nashville, Tennessee, the main event that everybody wanted to see, Cub Swanson versus Artem Lobov, and people were hating on this main event from minute one, and you know what, it wasn't that bad in the end. You know, Artem went in there, and I think I said on last week's show that he deserves a little bit more respect than he's getting from people who are slagging off the main event. It was competitive in so much as Lobov stood there and traded as best he could. Swanson looked to cut above, but you've got to give Lobov the credit. He went in there, he did a great job of being a good foil for Swanson during fight week, and I think he came away with a lot more respect than perhaps he went in with, which I think is a good thing for him.
Yeah, I mean, look, in terms of his performance, he probably performed to the absolute maximum of his potential and to the best of his ability. Now, is that ability good enough to say knock out and defeat or submit the top 5, 6, 7, 8 featherweights in the world? Probably not. But he got himself into a situation where he was able to test himself and see if he could. Now, he wasn't knocked out, he wasn't submitted, but he was, over the course of 25 minutes, outclassed, outmastered by a true veteran in Cub Swanson, who's got more fights under his belt, has fought much more higher level competition throughout his entire career compared to Artem Lobov. But, you know, in Lobov's defense, you know, he did give Cub a really tough first round. He won that first round on the judges' scorecards, and I think on everyone's scorecards. And already in that first round, everyone was like, well, hang on a second. You know, and I saw Dan Stuck, you know, the MMA Junkie co-founder and owner, kind of say, well, it would have been interesting if this was a 3-round fight. And, you know, that kind of does make you think, if this was a co-main event, for example, how the second and third round would have fared for Artem. Maybe would have, you know, expended a little bit more energy to perhaps, you know, close out another round, and then it would have been all on Cub's hands to try and finish him in the third. But it was a 5-round fight. He definitely won the first round, but after that, you know, Cub Swanson kind of really started to kind of trade and kind of let go of his hands. And I think our very own Mike Bond of MMA Junkie said he's rattled off 209 significant strikes, which is the most in any featherweight fight in UFC and WEC history, which is an amazing stat in itself. But you know, before we talk about Cub Swanson, in terms of Artem Lobov, I think he comes away, and people's respect for him has definitely improved. You know, he's definitely got a hell of a chin on him, and I'm sure, you know, again, with some, you know, careful matchmaking, there are definitely fighters on the roster that he can beat, and he'll come back, I suppose, to Dublin and to this European UFC circuit, able to perhaps get on some more cards down the road.
Yeah, I think those of us who've been operating in the European scene for as long as we have, we were aware of Artem before he got onto the Ultimate Fighter and obviously ended up in the UFC. And the one thing that he is renowned for, and his record in many ways reflects this, he doesn't turn fights down. He will step in at 1 day's notice, 1 week's notice. He doesn't care. He just loves to get in there and test himself. And this was a great opportunity for him. He made this main event happen. And And I know people were saying it's not a worthy main event. What is he doing in a main event? All this sort of stuff. But he made this opportunity happen for himself, and in many ways, I think it's a bit of an example to some other fighters in the UFC what you can actually achieve if you're prepared to actually stick your neck out and say a few words now and again. Artem isn't a trash talker, really. He's quite a quietly spoken guy. He sometimes comes across as a bit intense, but he's actually a great guy to deal with. He's very respectful. He's a true martial artist, and he gets in there with a lot of respect for his opponents. And he said the things he needed to say to get the fight that he wanted to get. It didn't go his way, as you say. Swanson outclassed him. There was a clear difference in levels between the two, but what you did see from Lobov was an awful lot of heart, and he fought for 25 minutes of the fight. He didn't stop for the entire fight, and I agree with you. I thought he shaded the opening round. Two of the judges agreed as well. I think they gave him the opening round 49-46 on two of the cards. The third card gave it as a whitewash to Cub Swanson, 50-45. But yeah, I don't think Lobov did himself any harm at all. And promoters need fighters like him, people who will just step in and compete anytime, any place, anywhere. And this was a bit of a coming out party for him, if you like. A big spotlight for him. Perhaps he just overreached a little bit. It'd be interesting to see who they put him with next. Obviously, they're going to have to move him down a level a bit. But what we do know is that he's a guy who can go in there, and even against the top contender like Cub Swanson, he can go in there and be competitive and put on a competitive contest. He lost the fight deserved and deservedly so, if you like. But I thought he did a good job, and as you say, I don't think anyone can criticise him for his output and the way he went about his business on Fight Night and beforehand. I thought he did a solid job. But obviously, the main story to come out of that main event is what happens next for Cub Swanson. He's been around this sport for so long. He did have an opportunity at Jose Aldo many years ago and got knocked out very quickly, and has never really been anywhere near a title shot since, despite operating right at that elite level pretty much all the way through. Right now, the way the division seems to be shaking out, he might just be the next guy in line. What do you think? He called for that. He wasn't too aggressive in doing so, but he did say that he'd, in a very polite Cub Swanson kind of way, he said he'd like to fight the winner of the Max Holloway-Jose Aldo fight. And to me, that makes a lot of sense. I don't know what they'd do with him otherwise. Maybe a Ricardo Lamas possibly, but I think maybe he deserves it for longevity as much as anything.
Yeah, I think depending on how things shake out, he could be in the running. A few years ago, he'd racked up this amazing 6-fight win streak, and he was put into a position where he was fighting Frankie Edgar in a main event. This is back in November of 2014, and he got his backside handed to him by Frankie Edgar, who ended up finishing him in the fifth round. In one of the more I think it was Demetrius Johnson's got the latest finish ever at 4 minutes and 59 seconds of the fifth round. Frankie Edgar that night got it done in 4 minutes and 56 seconds of the fifth round. But that was a pivotal fight for Cub Swanson, because had he won that fight, he would have got a crack at Jose Aldo back then. And then he followed that up by a consecutive loss at the time against Max Holloway. And then at the time you're thinking, oh, well, have we seen the best days of Cub Swanson? Is he perhaps a little punch drunk? Can he not compete anymore? Has he not been able to evolve and develop his game to compete against the likes of a young whippersnapper and Max Holloway? But what he's done is he's been able to build up yet another streak. Artem Lobov was his fourth straight victory. Now, what we've got is a very interesting situation developing in this, I suppose, new featherweight division, because we've got Jose Aldo and Max Holloway, the official and the interim champion. They're going to be fighting very, very shortly to unify those belts. But then we've got another fight booked between Yair Rodriguez and Frankie Edgar. Now, that fight could potentially produce a number one contender for the winner of Aldo and Holloway. But we don't know how that fight's going to develop and what's going to happen, if there's going to be any long-term injury sustained by the winner of that fight. We just don't know. So I think it might be in Cub Swanson's best interest, and I think he's going to do this anyway, is just to take some time out. He's sitting on a nice 4-fight win streak. His missus is about to give birth in August, if I'm not mistaken. So I'm sure he wants to take some personal time out anyway. And to be fair, I think he should. After going 5 rounds with Artem Lobov, and before that going 3 rounds with the Korean Superboy Doo Ho Choi, it might be a good idea to kind of give his skull and his body a bit of a rest anyway. Let's see how things shake out and develop. But I think you're looking at right now is Cub Swanson's in a position to potentially challenge for the title, but we have to see how things shake out between Yair Rodriguez and Frankie Edgar. I think the winner of that fight might potentially just nudge Cub for the time being, and then if that's the case, I think Cub just needs one more fight against a top 5 ranked opponent. You mentioned Ricardo Lamas. I'll be happy for him to fight Ricardo Lamas. That would be a fight I'd like to see. Ricardo Lamas does have a win against Cub Swanson, so that would be a nice little rematch. And Lamas is also kind of ranked up or thereabouts with Cub. So yeah, that one makes the world of sense if he doesn't get the next title shot, of course.
There's a lot of moving pieces to this whole featherweight picture, because I agree with what you're saying about the Frankie Edgar Yair Rodriguez fight, but I think you've got 2 different things that need to fall into line. Really, you've got Holloway faces Jose Aldo for the Unified Championship, right? If Aldo were to win that fight and Edgar were to beat Yair Rodriguez, I think Cub Swanson might just leapfrog to the front of the queue. Reason for that is we've seen Edgar versus Aldo twice before.
Yeah.
Do we want to see it again straight away, or do we want to see a different contender in there with Jose? And Swanson's got the rematch angle. He got beat badly, but that was a good few years ago now. He's come back. He's in good form. That's a sellable fight. I think if Yair Rodriguez wins, I don't think there's any shadow of a doubt he will get the push and he will get the title fight next. So from a business standpoint, I think that makes all the sense in the world to the UFC to push their Mexican star. So I think that makes a lot of sense. And that's irrespective of who wins the title fight. So I think if Edgar and Aldo both win, Swanson comes into the picture. I guess it really depends on how long he wants to wait. Ricardo Lamas is available. Chan Sung Jung might well gate crash that little championship picture as well. So there's lots of different things that we need to see play out almost before we know who's likely to be the number 1 contender. I think if Rodriguez wins, I think that's probably the clearest cut scenario. But I think if Edgar wins, and then it's down to whether Holloway beats Aldo. If Holloway beats Aldo, then fine, we've got ourselves a fresh championship fight. But if it's Aldo versus Edgar 3, then it's a slightly tougher sell just because we've seen it before, and Aldo has outpointed Edgar in fights that have been okay to watch, but they've not been sort of fight of the year contender fights, So that might pump the brakes on that, and then we might see a different contender come to the surface. But interesting to see how all of that shakes out. Someone else who I'm interested to see what happens with him is Al Iaquinta. He took on Diego Sanchez in the co-main event, and there is a big question mark over this. Diego Sanchez is one of these guys. 1 minute you look at him and you think the guy is in ridiculously good shape. His cardio looked on point. Everything about him, he looked as good in fight week as we've seen him for a long time. But he has been through a lot of wars. And then you got Al Iaquinta, who, because of everything that's happened over the last few years, he's had 2 years away from the octagon, where he was a contender or a rising contender at the time. How much of the fire had gone away from Al Iaquinta during those 2 years off? And how would he be? How much ring rust would there be when he got back in there against a pressure fighter like Diego Sanchez? Well, we got the answer in just under 100 seconds. Al Iaquinta knocking out Diego Sanchez in pretty brutal fashion, 1 minute 38 seconds. As decisive a win as you could possibly wish for on your comeback after 2 years. Didn't really see much evidence of ring rust, and Iaquinta looks like he's a force again. But after the fight, he's still complaining to the UFC. He seemed pretty miffed that he didn't get a post-fight bonus. Um, and we've got two fighters who they seem to be going in completely different directions. You've got Iaquinta, who looks like he's on the way up, and Diego Sanchez, who and we'll talk about him after Al, but he looks like he's going the other way. I mean, what did you make of Iaquinta, and where do you see him slotting in, given that he's been out for so long?
He looked amazing, Simon. Really, really great performance. And like you said, I think the big question mark on him was how he would perform, being out for 2 years. He looked in great shape. He looked in good spirits, looked jovial as he was walking out, really kind of soaking up and enjoying the moment. And then he rattles off a few strikes, and Diego Sanchez falls like a deck chair. And yeah, it's unfortunate, this whole situation with him not happy with how he's being reimbursed for his performances for the UFC, and that in itself is a topic. It's kind of a strange one, because you, the fighter, you're responsible for the contracts you sign, so you've already kind of agreed to the terms of the contract and what you're going to get paid, and these performance bonuses, which can potentially be debatable on a night when there's so many great performances, are still discretionary bonuses, so you're not guaranteed that money. Now, I know he's kind of said in interviews, there's been, he's been disgruntled with some other things outside of, what his show and win money is. Things like appearances, media appearances, things for Reebok, and how much reimbursement goes on there. But I don't think we'd see him fight again, and he came back after 2 years because he needed to kind of, I suppose, fill his pockets. He's just at the start of his real estate career, and he kind of let that be known in his post-fight interview with Brian Stan as well. But for the life of me, I just wish that cooler heads could prevail here, both on the UFC side and on our side, because what you've got here is arguably, definitely one of the best fighters in the world in that lightweight division. Someone that's got plenty of upside given his age. He's got a spunky personality, which is fantastic. A sellable, marketable fighter, and you never want to, I suppose, dry the well of potential stars, and you've got one on your hands here in Iaquinta, especially when the New York market is still fairly new to you, and you want to still keep filling these kind of events. MSG is going to be easy because they're going to always throw their bigger stars at MSG. But what about when they go Buffalo and Rochester and some of these other places? You know what I mean? So I'm really kind of hoping they sort things out, because I just want to see him fight more consistently. He's great.
Yeah, totally agree. And you absolutely hit the nail on the head with the New York thing. And it is about those other shows, They're talking about, I think they're looking at a show in the Nassau Coliseum on Long Island, which is home turf for Al Iaquinta, and you mentioned, the upstate New York shows, and, they talk about possibly Syracuse and Rochester, and obviously we've had Buffalo, but that team, that Serra-Longo team, that should really be your sort of like your sort of home team for these events, Aljamain Sterling, Jan Vellante, if you can get him on those shows as well, Chris Weidman, and Al Iaquinta. And Iaquinta, I love him. I think he's great. But the thing about him is he's an exciting fighter to watch. I think the fact that we hadn't seen him for 2 years, and he came back, and it was as if he'd fought sort of 8 weeks ago. He didn't look like he missed a beat at all. He looked outstanding and put on a great performance. I just hope, as you say, that both him and the UFC can get round the table, sort something out. I don't know how many fights he's got left on his existing contract, but maybe re-up him, tweak it, because I think he's got a pre-Reebok contract right now, I think. So I think for those fighters who've got contracts that were signed pre-Reebok, there's an argument for saying maybe those guys need renegotiating, but those contracts are signed, right? So, it's a tricky one. But the best thing you can do, I guess, is to fight that contract through as quickly as you can, because that way you're getting closer to the time when you can get your new deal. And someone like Iaquinta would be a valuable asset to Bellator as well. He's a good age, and that would be a good get for them, which means he will have options. So the best thing he can do is to stay as active as he possibly can while building his own star power within the UFC, market himself well, He's marketing real estate, market himself, and keep taking competitive fights, keep winning competitive fights, and even if you drop in the occasional defeat every now and again, be competitive in those losses. Just stay relevant in that lightweight conversation. Then when it comes the time for your deal to be re-upped, you're in a position where you say, look, I currently live and train in your number one market in the US. You're looking to be doing at least 4 shows a year in this region. I'm here. I can draw for you in those smaller territories within New York. So, Madison Square Garden, Barclays Center, easy. But the other ones, people like Al Iaquinta can be really valuable. So, I think that's probably the best way forward for him. I don't want to see him leave the UFC. I think he's just getting started, really, and he could go on a run if he can keep everything together and not be too distracted by outside things. Leave that to his management to deal with. Concentrate on becoming the best fighter in the world. He could become a serious threat. I mean, he already is a serious threat. But imagine Al Iaquinta on a 4-fight win streak, and he's going to be knocking on the door. So stay active. Keep those competitive fights coming, and by all means talk about your contractual position if you must. But it's all about the more relevant you are inside the octagon, the easier it's going to be for you to strike a deal outside the octagon. So I think that's got to be the way forward for Al Iaquinta. Let's talk about the other side of the coin, Sandhu. Diego Sanchez, the original Ultimate Fighter, someone who demands and deserves all the respect in the world from fellow fighters, media members, fans. He's a great guy to chat to. He's a great guy to watch fight. He's been involved in some absolute slobber knockers inside the octagon, to quote good old JR. And it looks to me like it's coming to an end for him. He's been in a lot of wars. He's taken a lot of shots, and granted, Al Iaquinta is a heavy puncher. I'm not sure the Diego Sanchez of 5 years ago would have dropped quite as quickly as that. But his punch resistance doesn't seem to be there anymore, and I don't know who's going to be the person to do it. Whether it's his coaches, whether it's his family, or whether it's the UFC. It feels to me, and I say this out of nothing but respect for the guy, I think it's getting to the time where someone needs to have the chat to him and sit down and say, Diego, we need to look after you, and we might be getting to the stage where we need to think about planning the retirement. And if he wants one more, maybe try and get him one more close to home. If he's in Albuquerque, try and get something out that way, relatively close, so he can go out as close to home as he can, if that's what he wants to do. But also look at the level of opposition he's in there with. Get him fighting a bit further down the ladder, perhaps. But yeah, I'm at the stage now where I don't want to see Diego Sanchez get beat up anymore. I've got so much respect for the guy, and I hope that the people around him are able to have that chat to him, because I know Diego is very, very strong-willed and very, very confident in his own ability. But I think we're at that stage in his career now. What do you think?
Yeah, 100%. I tweeted over the weekend, much like Uriah Faber, never technically won a UFC championship, but he did enough in the sport to warrant headlining a Hall of Fame class, which he's going to be doing this year. Diego Sanchez can headline a Hall of Fame class for the UFC in the next couple of years. You start off with him, and then you build a Hall of Fame class around him for that inducted class, because he's just done so much specifically for the UFC. You mentioned he was the original Ultimate Fighter, but not just with his performances. He's been in some classic wars. He's just a fight week get for any media member. He's had so many amazing classic moments and interviews leading up to his fight. He's gone from being the nightmare to the dream, going back to being the nightmare to being the Lionheart. He's always reinventing himself. He's always trying to market himself. There's been so many incarnations of Diego Sanchez over the years. But like you said, up until just last July, he'd only had one knockout loss on his record, and now he's had two in the space of a year. You know, he's definitely getting up there in age. He's 35 now. For in MMA, I do feel as though 35 isn't too much on the way down, especially in some of the higher weight classes and welterweight, middleweight, and beyond. I think in MMA you can have a slightly longer career than say perhaps boxing or other combat sports, just because of the way the skill sets are involved with mixed martial arts. But I think he's just been in so many wars, and when you get dropped like that by a power puncher like Al Quinta, but then also it's like, what do you do if you're not trying to, like, he's very passionate, he wants to fight the best, and he was again, like he was in the Marcin Held fight, when he won he's always thinking to himself, right, well, this is going to be the start of my run for another title shot, and I don't know if he would be comfortable in his own mind to just be a gatekeeper or to be a placeholder on a card fighting the up and comers. So I agree. I think what you do is you first of all let him have some time off, maybe 6-9 months, maybe even a year, and then just wait until the right card presents itself, whether it's somewhere on the West Coast, maybe in Albuquerque or Mexico, in a place that's going to mean something for him in terms of a retirement fight. And I think you give him the retirement fight, Simon. Let him go out, let it be built up, let that moment be something that we're promoting Diego Sanchez final fight. But yeah, I think it's time to call it a day.
Yeah, the one fight that I wouldn't mind seeing him in, if they could ever get it made, would be the Dan Hardy fight. I think that fight is one that I think they could do. The fact that Dan has been away for as long as he has, and he'd be coming back as a lightweight, then I think that's a fight that they could make. There is also the danger that the same could happen to Diego, because Dan Hardy is a power striker as well. But I think with the length of time that Dan's been out, and the fact that Dan will be dropping down in weight, I think there's enough of an intangible there for that fight to maybe still be relevant. But really, if you start looking, I mean, just looking down the fight card, we had Stevie Ray versus Joe Lozon, and Joe Lozon beat Diego Sanchez back at UFC, I want to say UFC 200. Was it UFC 200? I think it was. And Stevie Ray beat Joe Lozon this past weekend. Stevie Ray versus Diego Sanchez, I don't know if I'd want to watch that. You look at other British lightweights, Mark Diakiese versus Diego Sanchez, I think I wouldn't want to see that either. Just because I just think Diego has been through the fire so many times. He's got a great wrestling base, but he chooses not to use it, Had he adapted his game a little bit and thought, I'm going to go wrestle heavy here, then maybe he wouldn't have taken the amount of punishment that he's had in recent fights, and maybe he'd had a better chance to win some of them. I don't know. It's being wise after the event, I guess. But what I do know is that Diego is taking a lot of shots now, and this isn't a sport where we turn up to watch the same guy get his backside handed to him every time he steps into the octagon. And I think we're at the stage where the sport needs to look after Diego Sanchez. And as I say, it might be coming across as a little condescending. It really isn't meant that way. It is said with nothing but love and respect for the guy, because he is as much of a legend, I think, as a UFC has produced in the last 15 years. Not a world champion, as you say, but his contribution to the sport in terms of the blood, sweat and tears and just the sheer wars he's put on in the octagon, absolutely beyond question. So I hope that if he is in a position to go out on his own terms, that he can. The last thing I would want is for it to end up being like the repeat of what happened to Chuck Liddell, because we don't want to see people leave the UFC in that way. So we'll see what happens with Diego Sanchez, but we do obviously wish him all the best, whether he has another one or whether he decides to hang them up. Looking further down the fight card, Ovin St. Preux bounced back with a Von Flue choke submission of Marcos Rogerio de Lima. John Dodson went the distance with Eddie Wineland. That was always going to be a fast-paced, back-and-forth kind of affair. very, very close in some respects. I think Dodson's speed was the key there. Stevie Ray, Joe Lozon. Let's talk about that, Sandhu, because Joe Lozon is another guy who I think falls into the legend category. He's another guy, not a world champion, didn't win tough, but you talk about people who, he's in the Brad Pickett category for me, who, whenever you see his name on the card, you're going to get a good fight. And the amount of bonuses he's racked up in his career backs that up. And it was another. I thought it was an entertaining fight. And Lozon, I thought, easily took the first round, and Stevie Ray, after some very good cornering, actually came roaring back, edged the second on two of the cards, and then went and won it down the stretch with a big final round. Biggest win of Stevie Ray's career, would you say?
You would have to think so. It's definitely my favourite Stevie Ray performance, personally,
Yeah.
of all the fights that I've seen. I mean, that first round was close. He was very close to being finished.
Yep.
And it was definitely a 10-8 round. If you didn't score that first round 10-8, something wrong with you. You got to get yourself checked out there, because that was definitely 100% a 10-8 round for Joe Lozon. And then, like you said, Simon, his corner were like, if I remember correctly, you got to stick on the outside, stick to the boxing, don't engage, don't grapple, don't wrestle. And for the most part of the second and third round, that's exactly what he did. And boy, did he come back! I think eventually, if I remember, it was like 4 a.m, so my memory's a little bit hazy there. I think I might have scored it a draw. I don't ever reveal my scoring for any fight other than the main event when I'm tweeting a fight night. But in my mind, I think the way I scored it was a draw eventually, but I didn't mind it being scored for Stevie Ray, because I thought that third round was also potentially a 10-8 round as well, in his favour. So I really, really love that Stevie Ray performance. I think that just personifies what he's all about. He's an intelligent fighter. He's listening to his corner. He's got plenty of grit and heart and determination and guts. And 100%. Joe Lozon's been a big staple for the UFC for a very long time. This was a main card slot on Fox Sports, and I think what he's going to do now is just kind of carry that momentum with him to the Glasgow card. I'm sure he'll be on that Glasgow card. He didn't manage to squeeze the fact that he wanted to fight on the Glasgow card on his post-fight interview, but he did make it known in some of his other interviews in the press room in the back. But yeah, that was a great performance by Stevie Ray, and I think you're going to get him on that Glasgow card 100%.
Yeah, I think he went chasing after Brian Stan because he wanted to get it in there, but I think the interview had finished at that point, and I think Stan turned around to him and said, "I'm sorry, they won't let me carry on." So he sort of grabbed him as they were walking out the cage, which it was a shame. I think that was clearly what he wanted, to just get in there, just to round things off nicely. But I totally agree. That's the Stevie Ray we like to see, really gritty. I think it was either a 29-28 or it was a 28-28. It was one of them, which is funny because none of the scorecards said 29-28. There was a 29-27. There was a 28-27 and there was a 28-28. So, there was a little bit of discrepancy in there, but I think what we can agree on is it was a close fight. And Stevie Ray definitely had to come from behind to give himself a chance at winning. As I mentioned his corner there. They said to him, they said, "Look, you probably lost a 10-8 in the first round. You're going to really need to go for it now." And he did. He really poured it on in the end. And I think if he'd had another minute, 90 seconds in that last round, maybe he could have broken Lozon down and stopped him, because Lozon was out on his feet at the end of the fight. He absolutely had very little left, and it was a great performance from him against a really respected name. And I think that name value, people know Joe Lozon. If they didn't know Stevie Ray, now they do. So who knows? I mean, we could see Stevie in a co-main or maybe even a main event in Glasgow. You never know. Depends who they want to put him in there with. Be interesting to see what they do. Whether they go for an all British lightweight scrap, Mark Diakiese's knocking around, that wouldn't be a terrible matchup, or whether they look to bring over another named opponent, someone with a bit more international star power to test Stevie Ray again. So, but yeah, I totally agree. Biggest performance of his career, and another guy who probably picked up the biggest performance of his career was Platinum Mike Perry, who. He is must-see TV whenever whenever he gets in front of a camera. I'm a big fan of him. I really enjoy watching him in the interviews. I enjoy talking to him. I enjoy watching him in the fights. And against a solid campaigner like Jake Ellenberger, it was really interesting just how he went about his business. He didn't go gung-ho this time, Sandhu. He really showed a lot more maturity. I think he learnt a lot from the Alan Jouban defeat, where Jouban basically used his movement and his footwork to keep Perry at range and outscore him over the 3 rounds. This fight, Perry looked a lot more patient, worked his openings, and then when he found his chance, boy, did he explode on Jake Ellenberger. He hit him with a big left hand, and then when they clinched, he hit him with a short right elbow, and that was a crushing knockout from Platinum Mike Perry. He's moving on up. He's a major threat in that welterweight division now, isn't he?
He certainly is, Simon. First of all, that's going to be arguably by the end of the year on the top 5 knockouts of 2017. So that's a contender for knockout of the year for sure. It was a beautiful right short elbow, like you said, Simon. Mike Perry is an action fighter. Outside of the main event, Cub Swanson defeating Artem Lobov, this was my other lock of the night. I've obviously, followed this, sport for quite some time, and I've never really been too overfilled with confidence when it comes to Jake Ellenberger's chin, even though he himself, known as a juggernaut, has quite a few knockouts on his resume. But I thought if Mike Perry could kind of get his shots off and eventually catch Jake would go down, and he went down in devastating fashion. I actually thought Mike Perry might get it done a little bit sooner, because he is the type of fighter that is a headhunter. But like you said, Simon, he was a little bit more patient this time round. And I think he was just kind of figuring things out in those first 5 minutes. And it only took him a minute of the second round to get the job done. And I think it's interesting time now for Perry in this welterweight division, because you certainly would think that he'd maybe break in to the top 15 when the rankings are refreshed this week, because Jake Ellenberger was ranked at number 13, so you could argue that perhaps he could just take Jake Ellenberger's slot, and Jake Ellenberger would kind of fall back a little bit. But I think now onwards and upwards, maybe he'll get a top 15 fighter, maybe he'll be able to get a top 10 fighter, maybe someone like a Kamaru Usman, who's more of a grappling-based wrestler. That'll be an interesting clash of styles to see how Mike Perry would be able to handle somebody like him. Or maybe a Gunnar Nelson, who's got a bit more a well-rounded jiu-jitsu game to accompany his grappling. But sooner or later, Mike Perry is going to come up against a fighter like that. And that's why I'm trying to kind of figure out in my head where the ceiling is for Mike Perry. We know he's got great striking. We know he's got knockout power. He's an action fighter. But when he comes up against an elite grappler, jiu-jitsu-based fighter, how will he fare? And that's an interesting question mark leading into a potential fight for him further down the road.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Gunnar Nelson. I did a little story on that exact possibility on my new site, cheeky plug, MMA365.com. All viewers very welcome. I listened back to I didn't notice it on Fight Night, but I listened back. I watched it again the following day. And in his post-fight interview, he was asked who he wanted. I think he asked Stan, said, whose life do you want me to ruin next, he said. And Stan just, quick as a flash, turned it back round on him and said, well, who do you want to fight next? And he was like, I'll fight anyone. I want to fight a ranked opponent, blah, blah, blah. Who beat my last opponent? So it's that was the closest thing we got to a call-out. The guy who beat his last opponent was obviously Alan Jouban. And the guy who beat Alan Jouban was Gunnar Nelson. So maybe there's a little indirect call out there of Gunnar Nelson. He may or may not have known this, but he indirectly referenced that he wouldn't mind fighting Gunnar Nelson. I wouldn't mind that fight. I think Gunnar Nelson is known as primarily as a grappler. He's got good striking. Ask Alan Jouban about that. But also Gunnar Nelson has never been stopped. He's never been stopped by TKO. So I think he's lost twice, both by decision. So he has never been stopped. That, I think, lends a really interesting narrative to this fight, because it isn't just, Striker versus grappler, obviously. But Nelson can bang as well, and he's got a very awkward style. He keeps at arm's length, and then when he closes the distance, he dominates. He takes people to the mat, and he strangles them. So it's going to be really interesting. That's a matchup I wouldn't mind seeing. I wouldn't mind seeing a Matt Brown fight as well, even though potentially that would mean Mike Perry possibly fighting a guy ranked one spot below him. You could see Perry slotting in there at number 14, Ellenberger jumping out of the rankings, Brown staying where he is. From a stylistic point of view, that would be an absolute barn burner. Usman, I think, would be arguably, the toughest test he could have outside of the top 9, because he looks an absolute monster at 170, and he's coming along well. But yeah, I mean, you sort of look down that welterweight list. There isn't a bad fight in there for Mike Perry. It's going to be really, really good fun watching him, whoever he goes in against. Santiago Ponzinibbio is a great fun fight as well, because he's all action as well. That would be absolutely bonkers for as long as it lasted as well. So many options for Platinum Mike Perry and his own special brand of trash talk. Just running down a prelim, Sandhu, who are your standout performers on the prelim card?
Brandon Moreno. That's the fighter that I think everybody was kind of talking about from that prelim card, and he got a performance of the night bonus, and he's a really exciting fighter. I think I messed up his name on Twitter and called him the baby assassin. It's
a bit harsh.
Yeah, it's the assassin baby. Well, it is 4:00 in the morning when I'm going to get these tweets out.
This is very true.
You have to forgive me there when I mess up, but there's always somebody on Twitter to kind of let you know when you've cocked things up. But he is in a really, really exciting fight. He's 23 years old. He's Mexican. He can speak English, which is good in terms of trying to market himself to a more global audience. And he is now on this amazing win streak, which goes back to 2012, and it's what we're talking about here. We're talking about almost 10 fights that he's won in a row now, and his last few have been in the UFC. He has 3 in a row in the UFC, and he's the kind of fighter that the flyweight division needs. And I think, I'm hesitant to say that perhaps you should put him right up there, and try and fast track him to potentially fight Demetrius Johnson as soon as possible. But the flyweight division needs new blood, Simon. And that's just facts. And I want to see where this will potentially put him. He was ranked number 10 heading into this fight. Now, if he can perhaps jump to a 5 or a 6 or a 7 position when these official rankings are updated this week, why not stick him in there with a Ray Borg, and just make that a number 1 contender fight, and have the winner, fight Demetrius Johnson later on this year. But he is such an exciting fighter, Simon. I'm really, happy with the way he's kind of got about his business. The actual submission itself was brilliant. He got Dustin Ortiz into a bit of a flurry, got him to the ground with strikes, and just jumped on him with a rear naked choke. And that was the first time that he had been Dustin Ortiz had been stopped in his entire career and lost a fight due to a submission. So Dustin Ortiz, 28 years of old, he's been around the block. So that was a great win for Moreno, and that was one of, honestly, just a few highlights on that prelim portion of the card, because for the most part, the prelims weren't pretty. No,
the Brian Barberena-Joe Proctor fight I enjoyed thoroughly, largely because they started taunting each other, and at one point, I mean, both of those guys are action fighters. You knew you were going to get a good fight out of both of those guys. And then they were sort of spreading their arms wide and going, come on then, let's have some. And Proctor did that once too many. And Barberena was very clever. He stretched his arms out, but then threw a right hook from pretty much came in from stage right. And it was so wide that Proctor just didn't see it coming. And that wobbled him, and Barberena just put him away in pretty decisive fashion. that was a good performance. He's always one to watch. You know, we talked about Joe Lozon being an exciting guy to watch. Brian Barberena brings it as well. He's the sort of guy, you know, he can mess up your accumulator if you stick him in there with a more well-known name. He's going to give him a good fight and may even win. You know, he's one of these dangerous floaters in that welterweight division. So he's someone who's probably going to get a little move up in competition next time round. And we had a big KO in the first fight of the night at flyweight, and we don't see many of those at flyweight. But Hector Sandoval looked very good against Matt Schnell. He's someone. He was calling for a title shot after that fight. First fight of the night, and he wants a title shot next. So, you know, you've got to admire the guy's chutzpah for, you know, shooting for the moon. And, you know, hopefully he'll get himself a ranked opponent and he can move himself up as well. But, you know, I said this fight card was a bit of a sneaky fight card. I thought that, you know, there was some potentially really good scraps on there. They didn't all deliver, if I'm honest. We had a few more decisions that, you know, the fights didn't catch fire in the way that I'd hoped. But we did see some decent performances in there. As you say, just running over the bonus winners. The main event boys, Cub Swanson, Artem Lobov, both banked themselves $50,000 for the fight of the night. Mike Perry and Brandon Moreno also got 50 Gs for the performance of the night. Al Iaquinta can consider himself unlucky not to have picked one up, but I think that submission from Brandon Moreno was the thing that trumped him. Mike Perry was not going to miss out on a bonus after that elbow knockout of Jake Ellenberger. So that prelim technical submission, because he actually put him out, didn't he? In the FS2 prelims from Brandon Moreno, that's probably what just edged Al Iaquinta out. That was UFC Fight Night. What was it? 108, I think it was. UFC Fight Night 108 in Nashville, Tennessee. Let's do some Q&A, Sandhu. Let's do some Q&A. I know we've got a fair few questions this week, so let's make sure that because I think we got called out by Stephen Murray. Stephen Murray, I know you're listening. You called us out because we didn't answer both of your questions last week. I'm sure we will endeavour to answer your questions this week, and we'll try and get through all of them before we lock up shop and head off into the night here on April 24th. Sandhu, let's do it.
At the Britpack MMA is the Twitter handle if you want to reach out to us throughout the week and shoot some questions. There was one Twitter user who goes by the name of Be Happy who sent us, no word of a lie, I think a dozen questions. Now, I appreciate the enthusiasm and the passion to send us questions, but if you're going to send us a question, try and keep it to one, maybe two, because we're not going to get all 12 of your questions on the show. There's other questions to ask, and so we're not going to get all your questions in. But I've included a couple of his on this week's segment. But before we get to his, I'm going to start off with Stephen Murray's, and he says, with the exciting addition of Marlon Moraes, do you expect the UFC to sign Justin Gaethje now as well? So, Simon, Marlon Moraes, Justin Gaethje, at the moment Marlon Moraes is a UFC fighter, but he comes from WSOF. Justin Gaethje, if I'm not mistaken, is still technically a WSOF fighter. But WSOF have now rebranded and reformed as the PFL, the Professional Fighters League, where there's essentially, in a nutshell, a $10 million pool that's going to be distributed to all the fighters, and it's going to be 7 different weight classes. It's going to be a league format over the course of a year, which starts next January, and there's a few more details like all the fighters involved getting a monthly salary. I don't know what this means for current WSO fighters, if those contracts just rock over to the PFL or not. But to be honest, I'm just holding my hands up here. I haven't really watched that much WSOF, and I'm not familiar. I'm familiar with the names. I'm familiar with Marlon Moraes. I'm familiar with Justin Gaethje, but I can't tell you right now I've seen their last 5 or 6 fights, because the way I think most MMA fans, and especially I do, the way I consume my MMA, there's a hierarchy here. You know, you're going to have your UFCs at the top, then you're going to have the Bellator cards, and then being, Brit journalists that we are, if we could try and catch a Cage Warriors and a Bama card, we're going to do that. But then, then you got WSOF, and then you got ACB, and you got, KSW, and then you've got one in Asia. But for me, WSOF, we don't get it on TV here in the UK, right? There's no TV distribution deal here, so I'm not too familiar with their performances. But from reading some of the kind of interviews that I've read and some of the reports coming out stateside, it appears that Justin Gaethje is going to be following Marlon Moraes into the UFC. Is that how you've read things as well, Simon?
That's my assumption, and we know what assumption does. But it would make sense. I think, given the change of business model with WSOF, and the fact that they are now no longer the WSOF, I don't know what that means for the contracts that are still active. Maybe those contracts are now effectively open, and the fighters have the option of signing a new deal with the Professional Fighters League. The way they seem to be setting it up, it's very much, I hesitate to use the word tournament based. It's league based, isn't it? But it's within a period of time, rather than being a year round constant churn of events. It is a specific season that they're going to create, and the fighters will fight within the confines of that season. So, and it sounds like it's not going to start until January 2018. So that's quite a wait for anybody who's under contract. So I would assume, and I've been wrong many times before, but I would assume that what they're looking to do is to basically mop up some of these fighters who are competing across different organisations, put them all into this, again, tournament, league, whatever you want to call it, but still allow them to fight outside. So they're almost like, in the same way that you get, footballers go off on international duty, don't they? And they play for their countries and all the rest of it. They can go and compete in this particular promotion for this competition, but then they can go back and fight for Bama or whoever, assuming they're not on a exclusive contract, and not everybody is. So that, I'm assuming, is what they're looking at. People like the top guys in the WSOF, and Gaethje is obviously the one we're talking about here. You would assume that he effectively becomes a free agent at this point. I don't know whether that's true, but if it does, then you would think that he would, the UFC would be nuts not to sign him. I'm sure Bellator would be very interested in him as well, because he could become a marquee name for them. There's some decent fights available at that lightweight division over there as well. But he's world champion. He's defended his well, technically he's defended it 5 times, but in reality he's fought in tight 6. He was going to defend it 6 times. Melvin Gillard didn't make weight for one of those title defences. So, and his last 4 fights all finished by TKO stoppage. He's a dangerous fighter. I think it might have been the first fight with Luis Palomino. That was one of the fights of the year in 2015. And I saw bits and pieces of that. Same as you, Sandhu. We don't get WSOF on television here in the UK. So it requires a little bit of detective work in order to see some of these fights. And especially given the time that they're being shown, and sometimes they clash with other events that we're covering, it can get a bit tricky. So I've seen some of his work, and he looks a solid prospect who, if he jumped into that 155 division, I think he'd be a dangerous addition. But we've seen what's happened. Look at Will Brooks. He was Bellator champion. He moved over to the UFC. He got a win on his debut against Ross Pearson, but he's really struggled to find any kind of traction since then. So Gaethje, I think, might stand a better chance just because he's got the ability to end fights quickly, and he's got that aggression that maybe Brooks doesn't have. Brooks is a little bit more considered, but someone like Gaethje, I think, would bring a lot of pressure and a lot of action to his fights. So I'd love to see him make the switch, and if he ends up in Bellator, that would be a great get for them as well. So you've got the Pitbull fight that they could make over there, and obviously the championship fight. He could almost jump straight into a championship fight in Bellator. He's that good. So I'm looking forward to seeing where he lands. Wherever he goes, he's going to get more tests. That's for sure. He's 17-0. So anybody who's jumping in to the UFC, 17-0, 15 stoppages, 14 knockouts. That's an impressive record. Only 2 of his fights have gone the distance. You know, that alone, and he's coached by, I'm on his Wikipedia now, you can probably gather this, but he's coached by Trevor Whitman, who's one of the best striking coaches in the game. So, you know he's going to have great hands, and you can jump him straight into that top 10, top 15 at the UFC lightweight level. He's going to be very competitive, and that's what I hope happens.
Next question. Has there been 2 coaches on The Ultimate Fighter that hate each other as much as TJ and Cody? I watched the first episode and it looks like fireworks. So, 2 questions for you, Si. Number 1, have you seen the first episode and what did you think? And number 2, is TJ and Cody the biggest rivalry in Ultimate Fighter history?
Okay, let me flip these round. The answer to the second question is no, because nobody hated each other more than Ken Shamrock and Tito Ortiz. And if you don't believe me, go back and watch it. They could not stand the sight of each other. Some of these rivalries sort of bubbled up as the seasons went on. You know, Rashad and Rampage were getting at it for quite a lot of their season. There was a lot of winding up going on, especially from Rashad. So I think that was a little different. There wasn't the sheer hatred on both sides. I think Rashad was just pushing Rampage's buttons. But Tito versus Ken, for me, that is still to this day one of the greatest, most heated rivalries in UFC history. So I would definitely recommend you go back and watch that season, because they genuinely detested one another, and it made for great TV. As for this season, I've seen episode 1. Do you know what? I'm really enjoying it so far. I thought it's still the same old tough, because you know what can you do with that format? But bringing the old guys back and giving them another shot, and the fact that you've got someone like Joe Daddy Stevenson is there, and then you've got people like Eddie Gordon who are much more recent. You know, it's really interesting. You've got a real spread of competitors over the years, and they're all back in there again, and I think it's great. I'm enjoying what I'm seeing so far, and I think the fights are going to be. I think they're going to be good, and you know the presentation of it is always solid. I think you know they do a good job of producing it, but it's needed something just to give it a little bit of a spark to make it interesting again. And you've got a bit of a win double, because you've got the whole comeback element of it, but you've also got that bubbling rivalry between Cody Garbrandt and TJ Dillashaw, which is definitely one of the more heated rivalries out there. But I also think Dillashaw is more than capable of winding Garbrandt up. Garbrandt is a very professional guy to deal with outside of the fights, but when he's got his game face on, he can just flip like that. And clearly, you know, we saw it on the first episode. I think we've got a lot of fun and games to come. It might not be the most joke-filled season, but I think it's good. You know, in terms of the quality of the fights and the intensity level, I think this one could be a good one.
Yeah, I saw the first episode last week. The UFC's PR team send everybody in the media a special private screener.
Yeah.
So which is quite handy for you and me, Si, because we don't have to stay up until 3 o'clock in the morning to watch it. We can actually watch it earlier that particular day. I'll be honest, I'm really not fussed too much about the competition itself. I mean, it's a nice novelty to bring the old folks back and some of the previous Ultimate Fighter contenders, participants, contestants, however you want to phrase the terminology there. The reason I'm not fussed and I don't have any emotions invested in the competition is because it doesn't lead to anything. Yes, they're fighting for some money and it's a nice little prize pool there.
Yeah.
But the last time they did this, you had a title shot available to you at the end of the competition, right? And we all know what happened there.
Yeah.
And without that kind of carrot being dangled for the potential winner, it doesn't do anything for me. It just doesn't do anything for me. I'm being honest. And it's been a few years since I've even bothered to watch the first episode of The Ultimate Fighter. I haven't watched in a few years. Haven't really been bothered. I thought that the rivalry between TJ Dillashaw and Cody Garbrandt was really the must-see TV element of the actual episode itself. Whether this becomes the most heated rivalry and tough history, or what have you. It'll take the entire season to fully evaluate that, because you've only seen a snippet of what's to potentially come in that first episode. You saw TJ go for Cody. Sorry, you saw Cody go for TJ's neck, right off the bat, just before the very first fight. So if there's going to be a few more physical altercations, fine. I suppose that makes for great TV. But I think it's more the cerebral stuff. It's more the psychological back and forth that they're going to have in that close proximity. That's what I'm looking forward to. That's what I hope kind of unravels throughout the course of the season. Of course, you've got the Dwayne Ludwig and Uriah Faber element hanging over the course of the two fighters in this season as well. So for the first time in a long time, I'm going to give it a shot. I'll definitely watch the next couple of weeks just to kind of see how much more of this storyline between TJ and Cody develops, because that's really what I'm interested in. But like I said, the competition, not so much.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying about the fact that there's nothing beyond the finale in terms of where they go next. But actually, I think in some ways that's a good thing, because they've almost tried to force it to fit. What we have seen, if you look at previous seasons of The Ultimate Fighter, sort of early on, and the more recent seasons, they're not generating guys who can jump straight in and be sort of world level guys. The fact that they, the last tournament they did a flyweight tournament to give a shot to the winner against Demetrius Johnson, and Tim Elliott won that. It was a desperate attempt to give it credibility, but it was undermined by the fact that both the coaches were more deserving of the title shot than the guy who won the season. So that in itself was a problem. So the fact that you don't have that issue, you're not giving them a contract and they're just going to go in and fight on the Fight Pass prelims. In many ways, I think it actually helps it. It frees it up a little bit. And what you've got is people who you're kind of familiar with, and they're just fighting for a few bucks. I don't mind that. Something they could potentially do. Vitor Belfort was talking about a Legends League, wasn't it? You could do a Legends tough season. You're rolling your eyes at that. But, it's something you could do. It's something you could do, and people would watch it. You're telling me you wouldn't watch The Ultimate Fighter with Vitor Belfort in the house, and Dan Henderson in the house, and God knows who else they could drag up and stick in the house? It would be interesting. I mean, the fights wouldn't be the super high quality world championship level fights that they used to be in, but people would watch because of the names. And that in some ways is more of a draw than people that no one has heard of who might have a shot. You know what I mean? I think the format is on its last legs, and I think this particular season, I think it might just about work. But beyond this, I don't know where they go with it. I really don't. But yeah, I'm gonna watch it this season. What the hell? I'm a sucker for these things anyway. I'll watch them anyway.
Fair enough. Daryl Chumbley says, do you think performance of the night bonuses are a good thing? Ray Janelle is going off at the UFC as he didn't win one. I say scrap them and pay fighters more. So I don't know what the solution is here. I mean, the thing with bonuses are they are discretionary. It's up to the UFC. I mean, the UFC doesn't need to include bonuses there. It's incentivized for the fighters. Before it used to be knockout of the night and submission of the night and whatnot, and now they're trying to change it to fight of the night and performance of the night. The one theory is instead of having show and win money, is why not just have guaranteed money for all the fights? That way a fighter isn't mentally thinking, right, I've got to win this fight by any means necessary because I really, really need that win bonus. So and that sometimes might lead to boring fighters that are just trying to close out the show. If you're a grappler, you're just going to grab hold of somebody because you've won the first two rounds. You just want to try and cruise through or get through that third round so you can guarantee yourself a win. If going into that fight you know that you've already banked what you're going to bank, then you can just go for it. Then it's just all about trying to accumulate a win-loss record and trying to get as many highlight reel performances on your record to try and get to that title fight eventually down the road. I don't know what the right solution is. I mean, to be honest with you, the right solution is if the fighters were all able to collectively bargain and form some sort of union or association, so that they can all kind of have a unified voice heard, so that they can get their compensation upped. But that doesn't seem like it's going to happen anytime soon.
Do you know what they should do? They should let them like wear their own like t-shirts and stuff, and they could get sponsors on it, and they could earn a few more dollars. I don't know. Someone maybe suggest that to the UFC. That might be a good idea. But no, all joking aside, the solution for me is flat fee contracts.
Yeah.
And you see Bellator have done that with a couple of their signings. I know Ryan Bader explained that he's on a flat fee. He knows what money he's going to earn every single time he steps into the cage until the duration of his deal has expired. But what I would do, I would dispense with the bonus, the sort of discretionary bonuses. And what you do, rather than having show money and win money, you have your flat fee, but you have a finish bonus. Mm-hmm. So what it means is you get your money, win, lose, draw, okay? But if you win the fight by finish, TKO, submission, knockout, whatever, you get a contracted bonus. Yep. So that to me makes most sense, because that means everybody has an equal opportunity to get a certain amount of money going in, and they can have a little cherry on top if they can win the fight by stoppage. That then encourages people to not fight to win, because everyone's going to fight to win, but what you're going to have is people who, they're going to go for the kill, they're going to go for the bonus, they're going to look, and hopefully what that then produces is more exciting fights. Because if you know that you're going to get X amount on top by winning by stoppage, then I think that's the way forward. So maybe you have a flat fee, whatever that flat fee might be, and then everybody gets the same percentage. So you get a percentage of your flat fee added on top, tacked on top. So whether it be, we'll give you another 20% on top, or 25% on top, or whatever it be, or 50%, depending on what it is. But everyone gets the same percentage, whether they're Conor McGregor, whether they're Mickey Gall, or whether they're someone making their UFC debut. They get the same percentage of their appearance money, if you like. And I think that might be the best way to go about it, because it means people know they're getting a guaranteed sum of money when they step in the cage, and they can budget for that in terms of training and all the rest of it. There's not a situation where people work on the basis that you get show and win, and it's 50-50 split, isn't it? But with a win bonus, it's a much bigger slice. So maybe if the slice that you get guaranteed is bigger, and then you get finish bonuses, because then what it does, if the UFC ends up paying out a little bit more because they're getting lots of finishes, maybe that's not such a bad thing, because they're getting a better product. And if someone is just fighting and getting decisions, you're not having to pay them as much. So that's what I would do anyway.
Paul James tweets in and says, "What would our Mount Rushmore of British MMA fighters be?"
Oh, good question.
For him, it's Bisping, Hardy, Daly, and Pickett.
Are we saying four names? Are we saying four? Is that what
we're saying four names. And to be honest with you, I think he's nailed it. I think Michael Bisping, Dan Hardy, Paul Daly, and Brad Pickett right now is the way is what mine would be as well. I mean, that could all change if Jimmy Manuel wins himself a light heavyweight championship in the next year. But as things currently stand, I think that's it for me. What about you, Si?
Let me try and be different.
Go on.
Bisping, yes. Dan Hardy, yes. Brad Pickett, yes. The fourth one would be, just to be different, and I think it's a viable shout. Ian Freeman.
Yeah.
Ian the Machine Freeman, the first Brit to really get in there and do the business in the octagon. Got that memorable win over Frank Mir at the I think it was at the Brawl at the Royal Albert Hall. I think it was, and I believe that there was a backstory to that fight. I think it was his father passed away, either the day of the fight or the day before the fight, and they didn't tell him. I think they told him after the fight. So he went in there, beat Frank Mir, and then after, I have to go back and check that. But if my memory serves me right, that is what happened. Ian the Machine Freeman, I think, obviously with the growth of the UFC now, there's so many more people watching the sport. There are the more current names, but I think it's good to have a nod to the early pathfinders. And from a British perspective, that man was Ian the Machine Freeman. So he would be the first one. He'd be number one. And then, because you do it sort of chronologically, maybe you have him on there. Then you have Bisping, Pickett and Hardy all kind of fought in the same era. So they would be the other three. But yeah, I'd have Ian the Machine Freeman on there.
No, good shout there, Si. RG tweets and then says, exactly how deep should the UFC bury Todd Grisham?
Ouch.
So clearly he's
a fan.
He's not he's a big fan of Todd Grisham. I'll say this much. In terms of the broadcast, I didn't mind it. I actually thought Brian Stan had a belter of a night. I really just loved his call on the action and just his overall performance. Now, Todd Grisham, he comes from a professional wrestling background. That's where he's kind of spent most of his time kind of learning his trade and learning his craft. And then he obviously spent a lot of time behind the desk at ESPN, went back into the commentary booth for Glory. He needs some time. And I think the fans and the MMA community just need to give him some time to kind of figure things out. He's figuring out what works, what doesn't work. That was only his second, commentary gig. He's done the desk work for Fox Sports a few times now. But give him a year. Let him figure things out. And I'm sure he'll be kind of chopped and changed and put into different commentary tag teams to kind of figure out, what mixture works best for him as well. But, he butchered a couple of names, here and there. But that's to be expected. You've got everybody else. Look at John Anik. He's been doing this for about, 6-7 years now.
And he was calling Bellator fights before then. So.
Yeah, exactly. So he's been doing this for quite some time. And I think, again, going back to Grisham's style of commentary, he comes from the professional wrestling background of the WWE. He's going to put his own spin on things. But yeah, I just think you need to give him time. I think everyone's always quick to jump on anyone that's kind of new, that's different, that kind of shakes the place up a little bit, not what you're expecting. Nobody likes change, but, this is who the UFC owners, WME, IMG, picked to be one of the commentators for this Fox Sports series of fights. So I think, me personally, I don't mind him. I really don't. And maybe that's because I'm a pro wrestling fan. And maybe that's because I have kind of seen him come up through the ranks and, do his thing for WWE back in the day. I don't mind him. I mean, overall, Simon, what are your thoughts so far on the first couple of gigs that Todd Grisham has performed for the UFC?
I don't mind him. I mean, I can understand why some people have taken an instant dislike, because he is very different. And as you say, people don't like change. People don't like things to be different to what they're used to. I remember whenever Joe Rogan wasn't doing the analyst role, people would be, just on my timeline, would be raging. Where's Joe Rogan? Blah, 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 blah. Why have we got this guy? This, that, the other. The fact is, you need different voices. You need different people. You can't just have one guy calling everything. It's almost a physical impossibility with the amount of shows that are being put on. If you've heard Todd Grisham calling Glory fights, he's great. I think he's thoroughly entertaining. He adds a certain amount of passion and hype to the events that, some people like, some people don't. Mauro Ranallo, people love Mauro Ranallo, and I'm a huge fan. Now, he has a very unique style of commentary as well. He's very different from a John Anik, and who is also very different from a Mike Goldberg. So I think people just, I think Todd needs more time. I also think that people need to give him more time as well. I do think that his best role, and this isn't in any way knocking, what he's done behind the commentary mic. His best role for the UFC would be on the desk, interacting with the pundits in between the fights, doing the pre-fight show, the post-fight show, being that guy, because he's got the charisma for that. He's got the sense of humour that I think would work well with the guest pundits. I think he does a fine job as a commentator, and I think he'll get better the more he does. But I think overall, his best position would be fronting the broadcast from the studio. I think that would be a great spot for him. But I certainly wouldn't bury the guy. I quite like him, and I think there are certain commentary combinations that they could try with him that I think would work. Daniel Cormier, I think, would be a fun partner for him on commentary, and I think Stan was a very good partner for him. I don't know whether him and Dominic Cruz would mesh right. I don't know. I just don't know whether the chemistry would be quite right there. But I think that Cormier would be and Todd Grisham would work well as a pair, sort of a high energy duo, and I think Stan worked well as well. But yeah, give the guy time. He's called 2 shows, and I think he'll only get better the more he does.
Final question of the week. Adam Schoen says, who is next for Stevie Ray, and will the UFC put some big names on the Glasgow card, given the poor reception the London card had? So I'll answer the second part of the question first. The UFC did announce a few fights for the Glasgow card. No one that's going to, break any records. So I'm quietly confident that the UFC will put on some big names for that Glasgow card, only from the fact that this will be their second time in Glasgow, and the first time they had an amazing crowd there, and that Glasgow crowd was at times loud enough, if not louder, to rival some of the big shows they've had in Dublin in the last couple of years. So will they put on some big names in reaction to the poor reception the London card received? I'm not so sure. I think the next time they come to London, they'll have to really kind of make sure that they give Londoners and the British crowd a decent card to travel in for, especially those that come into London. I think the London card will need some work the next time they come around, only because I think the attendance dropped 1,000 or 2,000 this time around as well. But that was kind of justified with the rise in ticket prices, which kind of almost evened out how much the gate was compared to 2016. So we'll see how things go for Glasgow. In regards to Stevie Ray, I saw one Paul Felder react to a tweet online today if he was interested in fighting Stevie Ray in Glasgow. I am well up for that. Paul Felder's an action fighter. He's been over here in Europe a couple of times as a guest fighter. We saw him last time in Belfast. He likes coming over here to this side of the pond to fight. And I think getting a main card fight versus Stevie Ray makes the hell of a lot of sense for him. And I think for Stevie's style of fighting, given the fact that he's got that kind of kickboxing style, but he's also got that grappling and jiu-jitsu in his locker that I don't think Felder's got in his locker as well as Stevie, I think could be a decent matchup for him. What do you think, Si?
Yeah, I like the sound of that. I like the sound of a fight with Mike Diakaze, but I like the sound of the Felder fight. I mean, any two from that 3 would be a great matchup. I think in terms of the big names, I don't think we'll get a load of big names in Glasgow. I think what we can expect is all of the Scottish fighters to be on that card. It's a no-brainer. It was the reason why that crowd did so well wasn't because Michael Bisping was on the card, because he was the biggest name on that fight card, and he always draws, and people always get behind him or against him, whatever, and the Scottish crowd were definitely behind him that night. But he wasn't the biggest roar of the night by any stretch of the imagination. That was reserved for Rob Whiteford, who currently isn't on the UFC's books. If I was the UFC, I'd get him back on. I'd get him back on and put him on the Scotland on that Glasgow card. Stevie Ray, absolutely get him on that Glasgow card. Paul Craig, we already know he's on that card. He's taking on Khalil Roundtree. And we've got Joanne Calderwood, who is waiting for a fight. So get them all on the card. I think that, with a few well-made matchups around it, I guess we'll probably see a few English fighters on there. Maybe Artem can fight on that card as well. Get him over there. I wouldn't be surprised to see Gunnar Nelson on that card, to be honest. It'd be interesting to see what they do. Will it be a star-studded event in terms of getting the big names on? No, is the short answer, because it's a fight night event. And the way that the UFC are looking to do things now, they're looking to put 2 world title fights on every pay-per-view. They're looking to stack the deck on the pay-per-views, because the pay-per-views are where they make their money. The fight night events basically are servicing a contract. And this is what we all need to be very aware of. The TV companies have already paid their money, and the UFC have contracted to put shows on. What they haven't said is, we're going to put all of our big names on. They've just said, we're going to put shows on, and these are fight night shows. The big superstar names and the big superstar fights, you're going to have to pay a little extra for them. At least you are in America. We're fortunate insofar as we get the pay-per-views wrapped up, rolled up as part of our TV subscriptions. But in terms of getting the big fights over here, I just think the way that the business model works, that's unlikely. I don't think it's a realistic expectation. So all we can hope for is great matchmaking, exciting up-and-coming fighters, and the best fighters that are coming out of these shores. And in Glasgow, obviously, we want as many Scottish fighters on that card as possible, so that the guys up there get to watch and cheer on their own. And it gives the Scottish fighters an opportunity to fight on home ground, which they're not going to get too often. So that's how I see it. I don't think it's going to be a superstar-laden card, but you can bet it's going to be a sold-out crowd, and the atmosphere will be through the roof again.
And that's the lot for this week, Simon. That's all the questions.
Perfect. Tweet questions for us throughout the week. As Sandhu said, try and keep it to 1 or 2 so we don't get completely snowed under. But we will always try and answer them where we can. Tweet into @TheBritPackMMA. If you want to just generally chat, then you can tweet Sandhu @SandhuMMA, and you can tweet me @SimonHead. The website is live and open for business 24/7, 365. You can get that at thebritpackmma.com. On there, you'll get all the details of how and where to subscribe. You'll be able to stream the show live from the website as well. We're available on SoundCloud, Acast, Stitcher. Do we call it iTunes anymore? I think they're calling it Apple Podcasts now.
I have no idea. I'm not an Apple user at all.
Yeah, no, it was iTunes. I assume you can still subscribe via iTunes, but I think you can also get it obviously via the Apple Podcasts app, which I believe is a bit of new rebranding or a new app that they're bringing out. So you can get it through there. And did I mention SoundCloud? You can get it on SoundCloud as well. And we will bung it up on YouTube as well. That wraps everything up for show number 36 of the Brit Pack. Now, at the very beginning of the show, we said that you guys listening can give us a bit of a hand, and we're going to have a few topics that we'll talk about on next week's show. But given that we've got a little bit of a run-up until the next big UFC event, UFC 211, which is a couple or 3 weeks away, if there are any slightly off-the-wall topics, challenges, things you want us to talk about that maybe aren't the norm, just standard talking about this fight coming up or who should fight who. If you've got anything a little bit different you want to hear from us, MMA related of course, tweet us @TheBritPackMMA, give us a few suggestions, and you never know, we might see if we can incorporate 1 or 2 of those in the next 2 or 3 shows as we fill the gap until UFC 211. That's all we've got time for this week on the Brit Pack. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll speak to you next week.